Watch this.
Thanks for joining us for this special edition of the 208. I'm Brian Holmes. And today we're going to focus on getting to know Idaho's capital city. By the spring of 1863, just before the formation of Fort Boise and, well, Boise, there were about 100 non-native people living in the valley. By 1900, 10 years after Idaho became a state, that population was above 19,000. And the makeup was still very rural, with more than 1,600 farms on more than 113,000 acres of land, according to the Idaho State Historical Society. About 896,000 of those acres were irrigated, thanks to, well, the 568 miles of canals and irrigation ditches that kind of spider-webbed across the valley. Well, communities can't grow, in more ways than one, without access to water. And pioneers had to figure out how to get water from the valley floor and out into higher elevations, like up on the bench. They did it relatively quickly, within about 3 decades, or 1 generation. And you've likely seen or driven on Ustick Road in the valley, and it stretches 40 miles from Curtis Road, mostly straight to the Snake River. And was once on a timeline to become its own independent community until, well, time and growth got in the way. Water, like time, can roll by undeterred, only altered sometimes by the path in front of it. A change in direction can change a lot. Water is what made the Treasure Valley productive and livable, and led to communities popping up all over.
If you're in a barren landscape, the next obvious thing is you need to find access to water.
In the 1870s, a canal system began to take shape, a series of ditches to take river water where it wasn't. Think the New York, Reidenbach, and Settlers.
And by 1891, there were nearly 50 miles of canals that brought Boise River water as far west as Nampa.
Which meant homesteads and farms sprouting in spots south and west of the river.
We have Boise, who, central location, and we have a town of Meridian that had started to grow in 1893. And this Ustick property sat kind of in between the two.
160 acres claimed by Jacob Clemens in 1894, who filled them with orchards.
Anytime you have a product, you have to have a way to bring that product to market.
Back then, that meant investing in railroads.
And so the Boise Interurban Railway had a loop that took people and goods from Boise along State Street to Collister and to a number of points, and then back down along what we consider Ustick Road, back down into downtown Boise.
One of those investors of the Interurban Railway was a gentleman named Dr. Harlan P. Ustick. That's him in the top hat at the Golden Spike ceremony.
So this is where this name, Ustick, comes into the picture.
An ear, nose, and throat doctor from Ohio, Ustick also had an eye for business. And he had visions of building a town. So Ustick acquired some of Clemens' acres and laid out his plans and the plats by 1907.
So what we're looking at is the original plat of the Ustick townsite.
And people were buying into Ustick's idea.
We clearly see the Boise Valley Railway line following this route.
You got a train track that runs through, you got water, now you got people interested in buying there. Mm-hmm. What came next?
And so he ended up opening a bank, and he served as president of a bank in town.
However, Ustick wasn't much of a banker, and it closed after just 3 years.
But they were also able to secure a mercantile store.
And even the orchards found success in the form of a cider house.
There was a Baptist church that opened and built a building. There was a Ustick school, and it really did operate as a true individual community.
A community that was cut short, much like Dr. Ustick himself.
And in 1917, he was visiting some of his mining interests in Yellow Pine, and he died of a heart attack.
After that, nothing could stop the life being squeezed from his town.
By 1918, we're in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, and we're in the middle of World War I, and things are changing. And interurban railways are no longer as critical because automobiles have become the primary mode of transportation. Boise is growing, Meridian is growing.
And becoming actual cities, while Ustick tried to stick with its roots.
And Ustick never elevated to that level, in part because they always were rural. They always maintained that rural profile, and they never let that go. Eventually, those orchards became subdivisions, and eventually the city of Boise annexed those subdivisions into city limits.
That was in 1995. Nearly 30 years after, you can still see some of what Ustick envisioned more than 115 years ago.
The original bank building and the original mercantile building are still standing.
And so are the consequences of change.
Change happens all the time, but change also leaves breadcrumbs. And if we can take the time to watch for that change and to see what has been left behind, there's always a story that we can learn from that.
The town of Ustick lasted 50 years, 40 years after its founder's death, with the post office being shut down in 1958. The school stopped teaching kids a year later. Residents once tried to get those few remaining buildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but only the school was added back in 1982. Well, coming up, it's the last single-family home in the neighborhood once known as the River District, which is why the Hayman House was preserved for the future. Irma Andre Madre Hayman was born in Nampa in 1907. She was 12th in the line of 13 children born to Charles and Amanda Andre. Let's be honest, other than being an extra and much-needed hand on the dairy farm and the family band, both of which the Andres had, by the way, she did play piano. If you're 12 out of 13 kids, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot you can do to distinguish yourself. And Mrs. Hayman didn't, really, other than living her life exceptionally in its everyday moments. Widowed with 3 kids at the age of 27, Mrs. Hayman faced discrimination with where she worked and where she lived in Boise. She remarried in 1943, and together, 5 years later, they bought a house just north of the Boise River, 617 Ash Street, although it wasn't their first choice. But that house is now one of the few left standing to remind us of the neighborhood that once stood there. Was there a fence around it when you were?
No.
For Dick Madry,
There was a hedge.
the days of running around Boise's River District are still pretty distinct.
Yeah, it brings back a lot of memories, basically, because I grew up here.
He grew up in this stone house on Ash Street, a grandson of Irma Hayman.
There was fence, which is probably pretty close to the end of that concrete there.
This picture was taken when he was about 8 or 9, when this part of town was considered undesirable, except by those who lived here.
In the days as I was growing up, all the streets had houses on both sides of the street. And there were a lot of people down here, of every ethnicity. The Thomases next door, I don't think they ever had a key to their house. They never ever locked the door.
In the early days of Boise, the area near the river was still pretty rural. In the middle of that rose up the River District neighborhood, including the Hayman House, standing since 1907. From the beginning, and for decades to follow, this neighborhood was literally the other side of the tracks, with a spur of the Oregon Short Line still running downtown along Front Street. And back then, less desirable meant more diverse.
It was a working class neighborhood. It was a place where the majority of Boise's black residents lived, and also many immigrants. So from all over the world, from the Basque Country and Russia and Croatia and Japan and Greece.
The reason became evident by the 1940s.
Redlined is the term. There was housing discrimination that made it so a lot of black people and a lot of immigrants were unable to purchase property in any other neighborhood.
Which is how Irma Hayman ended up here, after being declined for a house on the Boise bench.
Yeah, this was a bedroom, and across here, there were closets.
Mrs. Hayman and her second husband, Lawrence, bought this one-bedroom house in 1948. A 3-generation home that, despite its sandstone construction, at times seemed to be bursting at the seams.
6 or 7.
6 or 7?
Yeah.
In a 900-square-foot home?
Yeah.
Which is why nearly every room served as a bedroom.
There were times that this was also used as a bedroom, and of course this was a bedroom. I slept on the porch.
And the kitchen, where you can still see memories of Mrs. Hayman, like her heart-shaped rug, served up more than just food.
She would sit right there at that table for a good share of the day and, read the paper and drink coffee. And, if somebody came in to visit, that's usually where they would sit, at that table. And, whenever I would come down, she'd usually be sitting at that table.
Irma Hayman lived here until 2009, almost up until the day she died at the age of 102.
She's not famous. She is being celebrated because she lived her everyday life in an exceptional way.
Sold to the city about 4 years ago, the Hayman House has been refurbished by Boise's Department of Arts and History as a highlight of what once was.
This is the last single-family home still standing on River Street. You know, even people who maybe were born in Boise and grew up here might not be aware that this was at one point a neighborhood. And now, you know, there's so much development happening. The neighborhood, part of this neighborhood, is disappearing.
From the original floors and light fixtures, the city hopes to keep this history alive.
The story of this house is a lens through which we can look at the story of the neighborhood.
I want them to know that this was a thriving family community down here, and it really was.
And Dick believes his grandmother would be as proud of this project as she was of her own backyard.
Yeah, she would be very glad that the house is still here.
Dick Madry, her grandson, lived in that house till he got married, the day he got married in 1968. I asked him if Irma Hayman considered herself the matriarch of the River District. He told me, no, she just considered herself one of the good citizens of the neighborhood. However, she never turned away any of her neighbors in need, and it was because of her there was a stoplight and a crosswalk put in at 13th and River Streets. Urban renewal in the 1970s completely changed that neighborhood into the industrial and busy intersections we know today. Believe it or not, there was a time when, well, no one wanted to be the mayor of Boise. Coming up after the break, we're going to look at how the city eventually found someone to lead, sort of. Well, you know how the 208 is all about a conversation, right? Well, let's keep that conversation going. All you got to do is text us to the number on your screen. We'll take your comments, your story ideas, any quirky pictures of Idaho you want to share with us, send them 208-321-5614. Remember, if you include your name and the hashtag the 208, we might share yours during a future show. Welcome back to a special edition of the 208 where we're taking a look at the city of Boise, which has been around as an official city for more than 160 years. And over that time, the city has been served by 45 different mayors. Not all have been hotly contested, but the first three were, because nobody wanted to be mayor. In fact, a large population wanted nothing to do with the city government. City of Boise's website shows the 45 people who have served as mayor, but the oldest picture on that page isn't actually Boise's first mayor. Boise's beginnings can be traced back to territorial days. First platted in July of 1863, the city would become the state's capital within 18 months. But the City of Trees wasn't actually yet an official city, so the newly relocated territorial legislature incorporated it for them, with the caveat voters had to consent to a charter. Hold on, no charter meant no laws and no taxes, which is how Boise citizens liked it, so they rejected it. Again, the legislature stepped in and passed the charter in January of 1866, with one condition. The city now needed to elect a mayor and a council, which they did in May of 1866. But Boiseans weren't anti-government for nothing, and those they elected refused to serve. Same thing happened again in January of 1867. So, Boise was without a mayor, without a council, and without a charter, which meant no means for people to buy property. Finally, in November of 1867, voters approved Boise's charter and elected L.B. Lindsay as mayor. But he wasn't having it either, and Lindsay also refused to take office. So, Idaho's legislature stepped in one more time and appointed Henry Prickett as Boise's first mayor. And for decades, Prickett's picture hung on the walls of Boise City Hall with the caption of First Mayor. Then, in June of 1936, Roscoe Smith from Mountain Home posted a piece of paper to the Idaho Statesman. Proof, he claimed, that his father, Dr. Ephraim Smith, was actually the first elected mayor of Boise. An election certificate signed by the Board of Elections from May of 1866. Remember when the winners first refused to serve? Well, Dr. Smith was the one who won the mayor's seat. So technically, Dr. Smith was Boise's first elected mayor, even though he never spent a day serving the city. Meanwhile, Prickett served just 2 months as mayor, resigning in January of 1868. He would later be appointed to the territorial Supreme Court. Dr. Smith, believed to be Idaho's first territorial treasurer, ran a drugstore as well as a private hospital in Boise. He didn't die here, though. In 1891, he was killed by a streetcar in Toledo, Ohio. He died without the desire to be Boise's mayor. You know, one guy who did want to be Boise's mayor was also one of the town's pioneers. John Lemp served just 1 year, but he served a lot more than that when it comes to libations. Born in Germany, Lemp came to America at the age of 14. And like a lot of others, he worked his way westward, hoping to make it rich in precious metals. But Lemp would find his fortune in another popular provision of pioneer days that also happens to be golden: beer. John Lemp would go on to become known as Boise's beer baron. The story goes, John Lemp first stepped foot in Boise the day after the city was first surveyed, July 8, 1863. He tried to make it in the mountains as a miner, but that didn't pan out. So in 1864, with what little gold dust he could muster, Lemp built a brewery in Boise on the southwest side of 6th and Main Streets. Yeah, that same crowd-pleasing corner, now known as the Old Statesman Building. Lemp claimed his brew was honest beer, made only with Idaho-grown hops and barley. Lemp's Boise brewery also spawned several saloons around town, one of which would burn down in August of 1866. Even his brewery was touched by fire. Not that it slowed Lemp down. He was able to parlay his business prowess to become mayor of Boise for a year, a city councilman for 20, and vice president of Idaho's First National Bank. The Lemp legacy still lingers, with more than a mile-long street in Boise's North End bearing his name. And that's not all. Lemp family later donated about a dozen North End acres to the city that would become Camel's Back Park. John married his wife, Catherine, who was also from Germany, in 1865, and they had 13 kids together. His brewery, at the one time, was the largest in the Idaho Territory, turning out 1,200 barrels a year. Lemp would also own a dry goods store, grew his own grain, and would invest heavily in ranch property and livestock to become one of Idaho's first millionaires. He was also very generous with that money, believed to have paid for the burials of more than 20 of the town's pioneers. When he died in 1912 at the age of 74, his estate was estimated to be worth $800,000, or nearly $25 million in today's dollars. All right, coming up after the break, that question, what's in a name? A two-way viewer is asking a question I'm sure some Boiseans have thought at some point. So are these street names a coincidence? We'll tell you coming up. Quirky questions about Idaho history is part of what keeps the 208 train rolling. Some of the obvious we can kind of come up with ourselves, but it helps to have help, and we get those generally by way of text messages from you. Lonnie sent us this. What is the history of Beacon Street and Protest Road? Eastbound Beacon is perfectly lined up to see the cross at Table Rock, and I can't imagine it's only by chance the opposite end, Beacon, becomes Protest Road. You know what I've noticed, Lonnie, is how many thoroughfares throughout the Treasure Valley become a different road the longer you're on them. For example, a drive north on Curtis Road becomes Veterans Memorial in Garden City, and then north 36th Street after you cross State Street. That's only in just 2 miles. Lonnie wants to know about that stretch between Kootenai Street and Beacon Street, the part called Protest Road. And he can't imagine Beacon and Protest, they don't have some sort of connection to each other than, well, the asphalt. Lonnie, you'd be right. It didn't get that name by chance, but by contention. The shortcut connecting the Bench and South Boise is only a third of a mile long. However, its history covers both convenience and controversy. Boise's Fire Station 4 was first planned to be built on the Bench in 1950, on the corner of Kootenai and Federal Way. The idea was for the station to serve the Bench, sure, but also the neighborhood just below, originally known as the village of South Boise. So how would fire trucks get down the hill and over the Reidenbach Canal? Well, a road, of course. Though the plan attached to the bond Boise voters agreed to wasn't how it would end up. The road was supposed to attach Kootenai Street on the Bench to Highland Street below. Then when construction began in March of 1950, neighbors noticed its approach to Boise Avenue was much further north and farther away from South Boise homes. So more than 500 showed up to a meeting at Garfield Elementary to protest the, quote, entirely different location of the new intersection. This meeting marked the formation of the South Boise Citizens Protest Committee. Well, that connection, it would be completed, despite the demonstrators. But its name would be a nod to the dissenting neighbors. At some point, post-1950, Protest Avenue became Protest Road. As for Beacon Street, yes, Lonnie, it does line up pretty directly with the Table Rock Cross. Except Beacon Street has been on Boise maps since at least 1920. And the cross, well, that wouldn't be erected until 1956. You know, there's some speculation as to why plans changed from Highland to Beacon, and they have to do with land owned by the then mayor, Potter Howard, being located off Beacon. Therefore, pushing traffic that direction could make for a prime location for some retail stores. As for how Beacon Street got its name, well, maybe because of the Boise airport, which at the time was located just three blocks to the north, which is now where Boise State stands. It was Bellevue, Belmont, and Beacon. Bellevue and Belmont became University and Denver, respectively, but Beacon still exists. Might help to kind of just drive around that area, figure it out for yourself. Well, thank you for joining us for this special edition of the 208. As always, we hope to see you next time and hear more of the stories from all across the Gem State. We'll see you then.